They once stood beneath the spotlight, adored by millions. But when the cameras stopped rolling, these stars vanished into silence. Some died in isolation, others in despair, their bodies discovered only days or even years later. In this documentary, we uncover the tragic final chapters of 25 Golden Age actors who died, and no one knew. Forgotten by Hollywood, these stars remind us that fame is fleeting, but human stories never truly fade. Marie Prevost. Marie Prevost was once the toast of the Roaring Twenties, a glamorous silent film star known for her comedic charm and undeniable beauty. She starred in dozens of features and worked with legends like Ernst Lubitsch and Wallace Beery. But when the talkies arrived, her career crumbled almost overnight. Sound exposed her insecurities, studios grew cold, and the roles vanished. Struggling with depression and a deepening addiction to alcohol, Prevost slowly descended into poverty. By the mid-1930s, she was a forgotten name, living in a small Los Angeles apartment. On January 21, 1937, she died alone from acute alcoholism and malnutrition. Her body wasn't discovered for 2 full days. The most tragic detail? Her only companion, a dachshund named Maxie, had tried to survive by nibbling on her corpse. The media sensationalized that horrifying image, but ignored her human pain. Prevost's death shocked the industry and led to the founding of the Motion Picture Relief Fund. Yet even with that legacy, her passing served as a brutal reminder. Hollywood devours its own, and once the lights go out, not even a star's death guarantees remembrance. For Marie, the applause stopped long before her heart did. Carl Dane. Carl Dane was one of MGM's most bankable stars during the silent era. A towering Danish immigrant with an expressive face perfect for broad comedy. He starred alongside legends like John Gilbert and Norma Shearer, often stealing scenes with his charm and impeccable timing. But when talkies arrived, Dane's thick accent became his downfall. Audiences couldn't understand him. Studios stopped calling. He went from a celebrity to unemployable almost overnight. Desperate to survive, Dane opened a hot dog stand outside the gates of MGM, the very studio where he had once been the headliner. Former fans laughed, thinking it was a publicity stunt. It wasn't. He was genuinely broken. Depressed and humiliated, Dane took his own life in 1934 with a revolver. His body remained in his rundown Hollywood apartment for days before anyone found him. There were no press conferences, no funeral attended by stars, no grand Hollywood farewell. Just silence. It was a cruel end for a man who once made thousands laugh. MGM issued no statement. In the city of dreams, Carl Dane had become a ghost, forgotten by the very machine he once powered. Today, only silent film historians remember his name, and even they do so with quiet sorrow. Olive Borden. In the 1920s, Olive Borden was a vision of elegance. Dubbed the Joy Girl after her breakout film, she earned $1,500 a week, a fortune at the time, and had a contract with Fox that guaranteed stardom. Her beauty was electric, and her presence on-screen intoxicating. But Borden was headstrong, and when sound films came, she refused to lower her salary demands. Studios blacklisted her, branding her difficult. Her pride, combined with alcoholism and a string of failed relationships, led to a devastating downfall. She attempted a comeback through religious charities and even enlisted in the Women's Army Corps during World War II. But Hollywood never forgave, and the public moved on. By the mid-1940s, she was destitute. Olive died in 1947 at the Los Angeles Mission, penniless and alone, suffering from pneumonia and liver failure. Her body was unclaimed for days. The glamorous star, who once rivaled Clara Bow, now lay on a morgue slab with no press coverage and no public mourning. Years later, when film historians began uncovering the sad ends of silent-era icons, Olive Borden's name resurfaced. But by then, her legacy had faded like nitrate film. Her death went unnoticed because the world had already written her off. She died not just in silence, but in cinematic amnesia. Richard Barthelmess. Richard Barthelmess was once considered the ideal American male. Handsome, sensitive, and a gifted actor, he starred in D.W. Griffith's Broken Blossoms and the war epic The Dawn Patrol. He was even nominated for the first Academy Awards. But unlike other actors who transitioned into talkies, Barthelmess's heart wasn't in it. He slowly retreated from fame, frustrated by the changing nature of cinema and uninterested in the roles offered. By the 1940s, he had retired entirely, living quietly on Long Island. He refused interviews and declined invitations to retrospectives. When he died in 1963 from throat cancer, not a single major studio released a statement. The newspapers gave him a few inches of column space. No grand tribute, no parade of co-stars in mourning. Just silence. It wasn't that he wasn't loved. It's that he had quietly stepped away so far. Few realized he was even alive. Barthelmess died as he lived his later years, quietly without fanfare and with a certain dignified sadness. He was proof that not all forgotten deaths are tragic by neglect. Some are the result of a man quietly closing the curtain on his own legacy, only to be remembered decades too late. John Bowers. John Bowers was a romantic leading man in the 1920s, often cast as noble heroes and dashing lovers. At his peak, he starred in over 90 films, rivaling contemporaries like Wallace Reid and John Gilbert. But as talkies emerged, Bowers struggled. His voice didn't suit the new medium, and producers considered him outdated. Hollywood moved on, and Bowers couldn't keep up. As roles dried up, he slipped into obscurity, reportedly surviving on borrowed money and dashed hopes. In 1936, desperate to resurrect his career, he visited the set of a film shooting on Catalina Island. Legend has it he begged the director for a part and was turned down. Devastated, he walked into the ocean and never returned. His body was found days later. His death inspired the tragic arc of Norman Maine in A Star is Born, a fictionalized version that became iconic, while Bowers' real story was erased. The industry that once celebrated him offered no memorial, no tribute. His death passed quietly, an open wound never acknowledged. In the end, Hollywood borrowed his tragedy, but forgot his name. Florence Lawrence. Florence Lawrence is a name few know, but she was Hollywood's first movie star. Known simply as the Biograph Girl, she was the first actor ever to be publicly credited and promoted. She helped build the foundation of the star system that would later forget her entirely. In the 1910s, she was adored. But after a series of personal tragedies, business betrayals, and health issues, her career crumbled. She tried stage work, then product invention. She even patented a turn signal for cars, but her name never regained its shine. By the 1930s, she was working as a department store clerk in Los Angeles, occasionally appearing as an uncredited extra. In 1938, depressed and alone, she took her own life with ant paste. It took days to find her body. There were no headlines, no retrospectives, no industry remembrance. The woman who defined movie stardom died in complete anonymity. She was buried in an unmarked grave, which remained unnamed until fans raised funds decades later. Florence Lawrence created celebrity, and then was denied even a whisper of it in death. Eric Campbell. Eric Campbell was the towering, villainous comic foil to Charlie Chaplin. Appearing in The Tramp, The Rink, and Easy Street, he was an indispensable part of Chaplin's early genius. His enormous frame and expressive face made him both intimidating and hilarious. But few know that his time in Hollywood was tragically short. In 1917, just as he was cementing his place in cinema history, Campbell's life spiraled. His wife died in a fire. He remarried hastily, then crashed his car in a drunken stupor just months later. He died instantly. He was 38. His death went unreported in major papers. Chaplin never mentioned him again publicly. The man who had physically carried silent comedy's greatest villain roles was completely forgotten. There were no obituaries in fan magazines, no career retrospectives. For decades, his grave lay unvisited. Today, scholars have only begun to acknowledge his impact. But for most of the 20th century, Eric Campbell was a ghost, present in every early Chaplin short and absent from every history book. Eleanor Boardman. Eleanor Boardman was the epitome of 1920s grace and poise. A frequent leading lady in King Vidor's films, whom she also married, she starred in The Crowd, one of the most acclaimed silent films ever made. Audiences loved her naturalistic style and modern beauty, But when sound came, she quietly bowed out. Boardman left the industry by the mid-1930s, divorced Vidor, and moved to Europe for decades of solitude. She had no interest in the public eye, granting only rare interviews. When she returned to the U.S., she lived in a modest home in Santa Barbara under near-total anonymity. She died in 1991 at the age of 93. Her death wasn't reported for over a week, and even then barely made news outside silent film circles. Fans were stunned to learn she had been alive for so long. For many, she had disappeared in the 1930s and never returned. Eleanor Boardman's life became a quiet whisper, an icon of a vanished time whose death passed as softly as her voice once did on silent film. Jack Buetel. Jack Buetel had everything: matinee looks, charisma, and a golden opportunity. Handpicked by Howard Hughes to star in The Outlaw opposite Jane Russell, Buetel was poised to become the next big thing. But Hughes's possessive control over his career turned into a curse. He was locked into an exclusive contract, blacklisted by other studios, and the film's delayed release torpedoed his momentum. As Hollywood forgot him, Buetel drifted. He took small TV roles, eventually working in insurance and real estate. He vanished from public memory almost entirely. When he died in 1989, there was no public announcement, only a death certificate filed in Portland, Oregon. No major outlet reported his passing. Some fans assumed he had died decades earlier. The man once poised to rival Gable, and Cooper was now just a trivia question for cinephiles. Jack Buetel didn't just fall from fame. He was buried under the wreckage of a career sabotaged by control, silence, and Hollywood indifference. Beverly Roberts. Beverly Roberts was once one of Warner Bros.' most promising contract actresses of the 1930s. She shared the screen with stars like Humphrey Bogart and Spencer Tracy, and her poised elegance made her a studio favorite. But Roberts never quite broke through to stardom. As the decade rolled on, her roles diminished, and she quietly stepped away from acting by the early 1940s. Unlike others who spiraled, Beverly lived a relatively peaceful but intensely private life. She focused on stage work, radio, and eventually retirement in New York. As decades passed, her name vanished from fan magazines, and younger audiences never heard of her. Even film buffs considered her a footnote of the golden age. She died in 2009 at the remarkable age of 96. But by then, Hollywood had long forgotten she existed. There were no public tributes, no legacy articles. In fact, many fans only learned she had died weeks later, when local New Jersey papers quietly published a brief notice. Her graceful exit mirrored her life's trajectory, dignified, quiet, and unacknowledged. Beverly Roberts' passing revealed a painful truth. Fame doesn't fade slowly for everyone. Sometimes it vanishes like smoke, leaving behind only silent memories and unanswered questions about what could have been. George O'Brien. George O'Brien was more than just a handsome leading man. He was the rugged soul of silent-era epics. Best known for starring in F.W. Murnau's Sunrise, A Song of Two Humans, his blend of strength and sensitivity made him an audience favorite. He became John Ford's go-to star in the 1930s, headlining several of Ford's early westerns. But after serving in World War II, O'Brien became disillusioned with the movie business. He declined most roles offered to him and preferred a life of peace, eventually retreating to a modest ranch. He didn't chase fame or interviews. He didn't even attend retrospectives of his own films. He became a living relic nobody noticed. When he died in 1985, there was no breaking news. Only a few silent film scholars took notice. The man who once anchored one of the greatest films ever made died without fanfare. Most of the world, including many cinephiles, didn't realize he had even still been alive. George O'Brien's story is one of intentional silence. He walked away from the screen, but in doing so was erased from the spotlight entirely. His final years were quiet, perhaps by choice, but his contributions deserved more than posthumous obscurity. Vera Reynolds. Vera Reynolds was a glamorous, silent screen beauty, often cast as the high society girl or love interest in romantic dramas. She starred in hits like The Bride's Play and The Satin Woman, adored for her expressive eyes and vivacious energy. At her peak in the 1920s, she seemed destined for a long-lasting career. But the arrival of sound marked the end of her era. Studios didn't renew her contracts, and Reynolds struggled to find new work. Her final screen appearance came in the early 1930s, after which she faded into complete obscurity. Her name stopped appearing in fan magazines, and even silent film retrospectives often forgot her. By the 1950s, she was reportedly living in a small Los Angeles apartment under an assumed name. In 1962, she died of a heart attack. Her death received no coverage. Not even local papers ran an obituary. Film historians only learned of her passing decades later through government records. A star once cherished for her grace and light died unacknowledged and unremembered. Vera Reynolds didn't just disappear from Hollywood. She vanished from history itself until a handful of film fans resurrected her name from the silent dust. Helen Twelvetrees. Helen Twelvetrees had one of the most memorable names in early Hollywood, and for a brief moment, she was one of its most compelling stars. Known for her emotionally intense performances in Million States Attorney, Twelvetrees was praised for bringing vulnerability to women's roles at a time when Hollywood often preferred them flat and decorative. But studio politics and personal struggles dimmed her rising star. As the 1930s wore on, she fought alcoholism, a troubled marriage, and a reputation for being too difficult. Offers slowed to a trickle. In 1941, she gave up on Hollywood and moved to Pennsylvania, where she lived in quiet anonymity. In 1958, Helen died by suicide. She was 49. Her death was not publicly announced. No former colleagues spoke out. Even fan magazines skipped the story. For decades, her name was lost in a sea of forgotten starlets. Despite the emotional depth she brought to the screen during her brief heyday, today Helen Twelvetrees is remembered by only a small circle of film historians, a tragic example of how a remarkable talent can slip through the cracks of Hollywood's ever-churning machine. Her death, like her decline, happened far from the limelight, seen by no one. Lila Leeds. Lila Leeds had everything going for her: blonde bombshell looks, promising roles, and the attention of studio heads. But her claim to fame came not from her acting, but from a scandal. In 1948, she was arrested for smoking marijuana with none other than Robert Mitchum. The media crucified her. While Mitchum's career bounced back, Leeds was destroyed. She was dropped from every studio, blacklisted overnight. No one offered her a second chance. She tried stage work and low-budget films, but nothing stuck. By the 1950s, she disappeared completely. Rumors swirled that she became a waitress, a secretary, or even homeless. In 1999, she quietly passed away in a convalescent home. There were no obituaries, no retrospectives, no mention in film columns. Even fans who remembered her infamous scandal were stunned to learn she had died. Most had assumed she was already gone. Lila Leeds was a victim of a double standard and a system that discarded her at the first sign of trouble. She died the way Hollywood likes to forget its controversies, quietly and without consequence. Marguerite De La Motte. Marguerite De La Motte once shared top billing with Douglas Fairbanks in swashbuckling classics like The Mark of Zorro and The Three Musketeers. With her expressive eyes and commanding presence, she became one of the silent screen's most admired leading ladies. But like so many of her peers, her career crumbled with the advent of sound. By the early 1930s, roles had dried up, and she found herself relegated to minor parts and bit roles. Her personal life followed a similar pattern of misfortune. She lost both parents at a young age and battled depression. Despite working in odd jobs to survive, she maintained dignity and avoided scandal. She simply disappeared from the public consciousness. When Marguerite died in 1950 from cerebral thrombosis, her death barely made a whisper in the press. Even in Hollywood, few realized she had passed. Her gravestone listed her as a housewife. The woman who once inspired legions of fans was buried without fanfare or acknowledgement. It wasn't until decades later that film historians began to recover her legacy. Yet for over 30 years, Marguerite De La Motte's story ended in utter silence. Her stardom forgotten, her death unnoticed, her legacy erased until too late. Carmel Myers. Carmel Myers was born into Hollywood royalty. A child of the silent era, she rose to fame in biblical epics and sultry roles, starring opposite Rudolph Valentino in Ben-Hur and All Night. With her smoky eyes and magnetic presence, Myers was a sensation. In the 1920s, she was one of the most recognizable faces in American cinema. She transitioned modestly into talkies, often in supporting roles. But by the 1940s, she was phased out entirely. Instead of fading into despair, Myers shifted into radio and business, eventually becoming a successful perfume entrepreneur. Yet despite her adaptability, the public forgot her screen work. When she passed away in 1980 at age 81, her death went almost entirely unreported in major Hollywood circles. No tributes, no documentaries, no special mentions. A star who once stood beside Valentino died in the shadow of history. Carmel Myers lived long but died quietly. While others were immortalized in film canons, her beauty and brilliance faded into the cracks of cinematic memory. She died as many silent stars did, not just alone, but as if she had never existed at all. Barbara Kent. Barbara Kent was a Wampus baby star and breakout performer in the late 1920s. She was best known for her tender performance in Lonesome and for starring alongside Greta Garbo in Flesh and the Devil. Her petite figure and gentle delivery made her a popular ingenue. When talkies arrived, she made a smooth transition, rare for silent stars, but fame didn't interest her. After marrying, she retired in the mid-1930s and never looked back. She refused interviews and declined fan events. Living under the radar in Idaho, she built a quiet, ordinary life. In 2011, Kent passed away at the incredible age of 103, and yet her death wasn't publicly announced for weeks. Film fans had long assumed she was already deceased. News of her passing only spread when silent-era historians stumbled upon her obituary. Kent's story is one of willful privacy, but also of neglect. She helped shape the early language of film and then was completely forgotten, even in death. Her story reflects Hollywood's tendency to celebrate women and youth, then abandon them in maturity, even those who chose to walk away. Glenn Tryon. Glenn Tryon was a dashing, light-hearted leading man of the 1920s, working steadily in silent comedies and early talkies. He starred in Lonesome, alongside Barbara Kent, and was admired for his mix of charisma and vulnerability. He had a boy-next-door appeal that made him perfect for both romantic and comedic roles. But his career stalled by the late 1930s. He moved behind the scenes, dabbling in screenwriting and directing. Over time, his name quietly vanished from movie marquees and casting lists. By the 1950s, he was living a modest life far from Hollywood's spotlight. When he passed away in 1970 at the age of 72, no media outlets reported his death. There were no eulogies or retrospectives. Not even Lonesome, by then regarded as a lost masterpiece of silent cinema, generated a mention of him. It was as if he had never existed. Glenn Tryon had lived through cinema's greatest transformation, yet his death was met with absolute silence. His face, once beamed across thousands of silver screens, faded from memory without a trace. His legacy now rests with the few cinephiles who care enough to remember the name hidden behind the forgotten smile. Edna Purviance. Edna Purviance wasn't just a co-star, she was the heart of Charlie Chaplin's early masterpieces. From The Tramp to A Woman of Paris, she played the sweet, expressive foil to Chaplin's antics. Audiences adored her, and more than just a screen partner, she was also Chaplin's off-screen love for many years. But after the 1920s, Edna was quietly retired. Though Chaplin continued to support her financially, she never returned to acting. Instead, she lived a secluded life in Northern California, rarely granting interviews and staying far from the limelight. Few fans knew she was still alive. She died in 1958 from cancer, and yet her death passed with barely a whisper. Chaplin made no public comment. Hollywood issued no tribute. The woman who helped build one of cinema's greatest legacies died in total silence. Her grave went unvisited for years. Edna Purviance wasn't just forgotten, she was erased from the narrative. Today, only film historians and devoted Chaplin fans keep her memory alive. Her death, like her later life, was hushed, proof that even the most beloved collaborators can vanish from the story entirely. Creighton Hale. Creighton Hale was a familiar face to early film audiences. He starred in The Cat and the Canary and Seven Chances, often playing the nervous, scholarly gentleman who stumbles into trouble. He was a top-billed actor during the silent era, and transitioned reasonably well into talkies, albeit in smaller roles. But by the 1950s, he was mostly playing uncredited background characters, librarians, butlers, professors. Despite being a pioneer of early horror and mystery films, Hale was largely forgotten by the 1960s. He never made headlines, never sought attention. His declining years were spent in complete anonymity. He lived in a small Los Angeles apartment and received little contact from the industry he helped build. When he died in 1965, the news barely registered. There was no press release from studios, no tributes from fellow actors. Even horror film retrospectives omitted him. Only decades later, when silent film aficionados began cataloging lost stars, did his name reappear. Creighton Hale's legacy had to be rediscovered, his memory stitched together from old reels and forgotten credits. For someone who brought suspense and laughter to early cinema, it was a cruel final fade to black. Florence Lawrence. Florence Lawrence holds a title no one else can claim. She was the first movie star. Before her, actors in silent films were anonymous. Studios feared audiences would demand higher wages if actors became popular. But Lawrence broke the mold. Studios used her name to promote films. She was adored, mobbed in public, and became the first actress ever marketed by name. But that fame was a double-edged sword. After a series of failed business ventures, injuries, and betrayals, Lawrence's star dimmed. Her fortune vanished. She lived in poverty and isolation in Hollywood, working briefly as an extra. She invented mechanical car signals and brake lights, yet never profited. In 1938, devastated by illness and depression, she took her own life using ant paste. Her body was found days later. The press barely covered her death. The first movie star died without applause, without notice, and without a grave marker. Only years later did historians and fans raise funds for a headstone. Florence Lawrence gave Hollywood the star, and Hollywood forgot her entirely. Brendel. Brendel was one of the most recognizable comic actors of the early 1930s. Known for his Swedish-accented routines, he was a staple in vaudeville and early sound comedies. At one point, he was Fox Film's top comic attraction, outselling even Laurel and Hardy. But Brendel's fame didn't last. As comedy evolved, his act was considered outdated. He kept working in B-movies and shorts, but by the late 1940s, even those roles disappeared. He lived out his final years in Los Angeles, reportedly taking occasional voice work to scrape by. As his health declined, so did contact with the outside world. Brendel died in 1964. It took several days before anyone even noticed. His death wasn't reported in the trades. His passing was mourned by no major publications. Even his most devoted fans assumed he had died years earlier. Today, he's remembered more for his catchphrases than his legacy, but his lonely death, unnoticed by an industry he once entertained, says everything about the cruelty of showbiz memory. Lincoln Stedman. Lincoln Stedman wasn't your typical silent film star, chubby, awkward, and perpetually cast as comic relief. He leaned into his typecasting and became a fan favorite. He appeared in over 80 films by the time he was 25, often stealing scenes from more handsome co-stars. His appeal lay in his warmth and relatability. But by the 1930s, as Hollywood sought a new kind of leading man, Stedman's roles dried up. He faded from the screen without scandal or public fallout. He married, tried business ventures, and quietly distanced himself from his acting past. In 1948, at just 40 years old, Stedman died of a heart attack. There was no press coverage, no funeral attended by old co-stars. His death certificate listed him only by name. No mention of his Hollywood legacy. It wasn't until years later, when old comedies resurfaced, that fans asked, "Whatever happened to Lincoln Stedman?" He brought joy to audiences and disappeared without so much as a goodbye. Hollywood once again had turned its back on one of its own. Claire Windsor. Claire Windsor was silent cinema royalty. She had the regal looks, the air of nobility, and the studio grooming that made her one of MGM's most prized leading ladies. She starred in epic dramas and was often cast as the noblewoman or the tragic beauty. She was everywhere in the 1920s, but the arrival of talkies shifted casting dynamics. Windsor's stylized acting didn't adapt well, and younger faces took her place. She attempted theater and charity work, then retired quietly in the 1940s. Unlike some peers, she didn't spiral into scandal. She simply faded. In 1972, Windsor died of a heart attack. News outlets didn't report it for days. There was no fanfare, no obituary from MGM, and not even a statement from industry veterans. Her passing was noted only in small print. Claire Windsor once reigned as cinematic royalty, but her death, like her exit from film, was quiet, unseen, and unremarked. She deserved more than silence. Jack Buetel. Jack Buetel was once poised to become Hollywood's next leading man. Discovered by Howard Hughes and cast in The Outlaw alongside Jane Russell, he had the looks and presence to become a box office sensation. But Hughes held him under an iron contract, effectively killing his career by refusing to loan him out. By the time The Outlaw was finally released, Buetel's heat had cooled. He appeared in a handful of westerns afterward, but his moment had passed. Disillusioned and defeated, he left acting behind. Buetel moved to Oregon, where he lived a quiet life in obscurity. He refused interviews and Hollywood reunions. When he died in 1989, there was no announcement, no press release. His death only came to light when a film historian noticed the date on his death certificate, months later. Jack Buetel's story is one of promise squandered by studio control. His final years were spent far from the lights, and his death was as muted as the career he never got to fully live. They once lit up the silver screen, yet left the world without applause. These 25 actors remind us how quickly fame fades when the cameras stop rolling. Forgotten in life, overlooked in death, but now remembered. Like reels of lost film, their stories deserve restoration. Let's never let them vanish again.